Now why I say that, I am from the South. But in the South, you knew where you stood. But on the West, you didn't. You thought you was free when you came West, but you wasn't. They had more discrimination in Eugene than I ever faced in the South.
Keep on wrestling to the break of day. Because God, we need a blessing. God, as my sister said, who needs a miracle? And oh my God, there's many of us that need a miracle. Now God, help us to have childlike faith in the name of Jesus. No doubt, but faith. So God, I thank you in advance for what you're doing and how you're going to do it. And God, I'm going to step out the way so that you can have your way. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
What they did what they could do to keep us out, but obviously it didn't happen. So shame on them.
In 48, we had a black community across the Ferry Street Bridge when we lived in houses and tents over there.
It was definitely devastating for the community because it scattered. It was that central location where activities took place and people would go.
Well, there was no fun. What the fun was that we found fun within ourselves. You see?
This is an ongoing history of lack of access to property, lack of access to home ownership.
We still have a very dark history that still lurks to this day.
On August 24th, 1949, Lane County demolished Ferry Street Village, Eugene's first black neighborhood, to build the Ferry Street Bridge. That area, now the northeast corner of Alton Baker Park, was settled by mostly black families as early as 1940.
The families, they lived across the bridge. There, because Eugene was a sundown town, basically black people could work in Eugene, but come sundown, they had to vacate that, the Eugene area.
If you were black, you better not let the sun set and you be in those towns, or else you might not make it out of there.
Before 1965, African Americans weren't allowed to buy property within the city limits of Eugene. There were deed restrictions on houses that barred black people from owning, renting, or living on the property unless they were domestic servants.
But when we got to Eugene, the woman said she was sorry because she thought his boss was going to rent the apartment for himself. She didn't know he was renting it for colored people. So we couldn't live there, so we went over across the bridge.
Those policies, the redlining, all that really impacts the ability to pass down generational wealth.
Black families that lived here, that had kids older than me, weren't able to take advantage of an opportunity to buy a home because you weren't allowed to do it.
In the 1940s, at least 5 black families, including the Reynolds, the Mims, the Nettles, the Washingtons, and the Johnsons families, built homes and a tight-knit community in Eugene.
They came here to work. And in order to be here and in order to come from the South, you couldn't just come here. You had to be sponsored here by a Caucasian person, to work here, or a job, which was a railroad at that point.
The men generally worked at lumber mills, railroads, and shipyards.
We're talking about a community that's part of a greater migration, especially when you talk about the African American migration. The greatest migration in the 20th century was the migration of African peoples, African Americans out of the South. My people went to St. Louis, other people went to LA. And then you have folks coming up to Oregon almost later when it comes to any concentration of black people. And I think the greatest concentration during that migration period was World War II.
approximately 5 million African Americans migrated from the South during the Second Great Migration, which began after World War II and lasted into the 1970s.
And during the war, and that's the big war, that's World War II, when black people was leaving the South for better jobs in the North, we was one of those families that moved from the South to the North. Now, when the war was over, history would tell you that America, African Americans, they had a lot of problems about jobs because America didn't need that black slave labor no more, you see?
After World War II, black men across the country were displaced due to normalized racial discrimination in employment practices.
All these black men was out of jobs, so they had to find jobs. So my father was one of those black men who was out of a job, and he came here like most of the first black families came to Eugene. My father, like several of the other first black families that moved into town, they had worked in their early years in the South in the lumber industry. So naturally they thought that by coming to the boom of lumber that they might be able to get jobs, but they was wrong. Because white folks brought their white folks attitudes and understanding about black peoples with them, which we call racism. So the first men of the families came to town, they generally end up with jobs like busboy and janitor and shining shoes.
Those men faced hostility and harassment. When they were in town, they always traveled in groups and had to be back across the bridge before dark.
People would attack them verbally, physically. It was the sundown town, so if they were out after dark, the police would be involved. You could be beaten, you could be thrown in jail.
Why did he stop you in the first place?
Well, I don't know. I believe someone must have called him and told him we were stealing, but we wasn't stealing anything.
Like, why did you just stay here? Why didn't you just move on? I'm going to be honest, I didn't ask them that, but obviously they wanted to be here. They had come out of the South. They had seen what they come out of, and this was definitely a better place for them. And so they were bound and determined, which they did, to make a home here and provide for the rest of us.
Tell me about the laws and how Eugene was in those days.
Eugene was pretty bad for black people when I first came in.
Where did you live when you moved here?
Across the river. We had some tent houses, so that built ourselves.
White people in Eugene called the black settlement Tent City, but its residents referred to it as across the bridge.
Part of, really decolonizing work and really listening to the voices of the people of the oppressed is to call it what they called it, and it is across the bridge.
They built their houses and had their own little community there, and that's probably why they kept trying to break them down.
Historical documents describe it as a village of army tents and houses. Old articles say the area often flooded, and the sanitation was atrocious.
And I want to call it a settlement because it wasn't really an established community. It wasn't a park. It wasn't a pleasant place, actually, although family and community makes one thing pleasant for children.
There were about 5 to 10 homes and one independent church building, all wood framed.
The church, Ferry Street Chapel at Across the Bridge was the equivalent of the Black Longhouse, right? It was the gathering place, the meeting hub was at the church, and all of the families were very faith-based. So that was an essential component of who they were and how they practiced was being Christians together.
The village sat on county property in an area slated to be occupied by the new Ferry Street Bridge. In 1948, a time of rapid expansion and modernization, Eugene was focused on economic recovery after the Great Depression. Plus, the city's population increased by more than 70% between 1940 and 1950. And the government heavily invested in infrastructure projects to help modernize the city. In March of 1948, Lane County government officials issued a 6-month eviction notice to make way for the bridge. Then, in July of 1949, the county issued a court order demanding that specific areas of the neighborhood be vacated within 10 days.
I don't think that they were squatting on that land. I think that's where they were allowed to live.
On August 24th, a bulldozer destroyed every building, continuing beyond the borders outlined in the notices.
There was a red line around the homes that were to be destroyed to accommodate the bridge that they were going to be building. And it didn't include all of those homes.
People living in the surrounding area were also targeted, their homes destroyed.
Homes were taken. People were displaced, and that ability to pass down a home from generation to generation was completely lost at that point. And so a sense of belonging, a sense of self-worth, a sense of community, all that was lost.
A really tight-knit community that formed relationships and bonds together, that tight-knitness was exploded and demolished, right?
Those residents were then displaced to 3 new sites, West 11th, Glenwood, and near Skinner's Butte.
There was open space where poor people who weren't given the right to live anywhere, who didn't have the money to go anywhere else, they found a nice spot by the river, or they found a nice open spot where they could exist. But as soon as it came time for somebody to make some money, then they just had to move. That was it. So it was a lack of respect, lack of dignity that was given to poor people.
A few families moved to a plot of land on West 11th Street, including the Reynolds and the Nettles. And since it was outside the city limits and free from zoning restrictions, they built whatever housing they could afford, which ended up being shanties or small, hastily made houses on a bare field. It turned out to be in an area with no water supply or electricity and no sewage or draining system.
They had basically a hole in the ground where they had to use the restroom or the bathroom, and just very, very poor living conditions.
How would you take someone where it was already inhumane and it was already terrible conditions and move them somewhere worse? And not try to help, not try to make people flourish, not try to do anything, and move them to swampland.
In 1952, a report from the Fair Employment Practices Commission declared Eugene the worst in the state when it came to how cities treated their African American citizens. Other reports described conditions as disgraceful, citing poor housing and high unemployment. According to a Register Guard article, the West 11th settlement's location was, quote, barred from installation of water, sewers, or septic tanks.
I think it's inhumane. It's inhumane to treat any being in that way. It's shameful.
You could not plant food there. When it rained, it flooded. There was no running water. The water had to be brought in. The creek was there. We're not sure was the creek healthy or not for the kids who played in it. We don't know, but I think these are circumstances that you find in the African American community throughout the United States.
Eugene's oldest African American church, St. Mark's Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, was opened on West 11th during that time. The St. Mark's Church congregation first met in Pearlie Mae and Leah Washington's home.
My God, that is who you are.
We would get together on Sundays, the black people out at the church, and that was our time to congregate and be together.
St. Mark was built in 1949, and we had about 12 members. It was organized in July the 11th, 1948, but we didn't get a minister till 49, and his name was Reverend J.T. Taylor. He built the church with the help of the black community.
It's the oldest church, isn't it?
It's the oldest church in Eugene, oldest black church, which at that time was colored church.
Priority one, the religion in these churches, and that's what held, that was the glue that held these people together too, you understand. when they were fighting this fight and kicking down those doors against these white people. I'm just telling you, those ladies prayed and gave them the strength to endure. I believe that had a lot to do with them wanting to stay here and be able to stay here.
We have a deep-rooted history and spiritualism and a connection with the above and with our ancestors, with ourselves, and with morality.
Today, that church still stands as a symbol of resilience and faith.
Who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation.
Other families ended up in Glenwood on a swatch of county land, huddled together in a community of small shacks. Others went to a neighborhood around 2nd Avenue and High Street. In the late 40s, it was the poor part of town. In 1948, the Mims were loaned $5,500 by C.B. Mims's employer, the owner of the Osborne Hotel, to buy 2 houses on a single lot at the north end of High Street.
That is, by 48, you had a white businessman who had bucked the trend and helped C.B. Mims purchase this property.
And the house next door, which is also part of this property, was a kind of a pass-through station for a lot of black people when they first come to Eugene for a long time, because black people couldn't find they couldn't stay in hotels and motels and that sort of thing. So that was used for a lot of people.
Their home became a gathering place for Eugene's small black community, as well as a welcoming haven for blacks passing through the area, including Ella Fitzgerald and Nat King Cole.
Most of all the black families in Eugene knew this as a safe space. Annie Mims passed away in this home after many years of living here, and all of the people in this community of color knew her and honored her.
It's now the Eugene-Springfield NAACP branch headquarters and established as a historical building, serving as a quaint museum and library, preserving Eugene's black history.
As being part of the black community, we share the property with everybody in the black community. So the house you're sitting in is the second oldest house in Eugene.
The Reynolds lived on West 11th. Sam and Mattie Reynolds were known as community leaders. Mattie Reynolds organized protests and was the first black person to run for Eugene City Council, paving the way for Lane County's black political leaders.
Yeah, it's been quite a few changes made. Blacks have been able to get jobs in places where they couldn't.
St. Mark's CME Church stands on Sam Reynolds Street, which was named after the patriarch in 1979.
For you to get a street named after you in a predominantly white town or city, Eugene, Oregon, there was a Sam R, and they changed it to Sam Reynolds Street off of West 11th before there was a Martin Luther King Boulevard. That says a lot, you know. And then to have a park dedicated after my mom and she was in the running to have one of the grade schools that they just built named after her. And then my sister to have a building named after her. I think my family has represented themselves very, very well in this community.
Pearlie and Leah Washington moved into a home on 2nd Avenue at the base of Skinner Butte, and neighbors circulated a petition trying to force them to leave.
They would hear stories about black people, made up or not, and they would embrace that. So as black people began to move into Eugene, they simply were resistant. They didn't want us there. They weren't going to house us. They weren't going to give jobs.
A white couple, William and Minda Gillum, lived directly behind the couple and refused to sign. Instead, they spoke to their neighbors and ultimately convinced them to drop the petition. In 1952, as the city's West 11th settlement drew publicity for its poor living conditions, a coalition of black and white residents took a stand against racial inequities. They formed the Lane County Fellowship for Civic Unity, a group committed to addressing and eliminating Eugene's racial disparities.
In the early 50s and 60s, we had our organization called CORE, but that was black and white. And that's when we went out and picket people that wouldn't rent to blacks and picket, we did marches. We went to stores and put pressure on them to hide black people.
A giant step toward dignity and full participation in American life and affairs was taken by the American Negro
in the 1960s, when most black people all over the world started seeing a big change. That was our revolution. That was the first awakening of Moses.
Around 200 people launched a campaign to push for housing and employment reform. Instead of protesting, they canvassed door to door in segregated neighborhoods and negotiated directly with employers. Their efforts led to job opportunities for black residents. Those jobs allowed families to earn money and move away from West 11th. The work of the Civic Unity Committee led to the integration of Eugene's neighborhoods.
Black people have always been in proximity to white people. Some bad, some who understand the injustice of the situation from day one. Abolitionists were here with us from day one, white abolitionists. And so we have to remember that as we go forth and not give in to this divisive type of idea and revisionist history. Even though black people were the leaders in our cause, there were those who saw the justice in it, and we have to remember them.
Ferry Street Village grew at a time when black businesses were not allowed in the city, and signs barring Negroes were still visible in shop windows.
When I was you guys' age, I could walk down with Lammer Street and see signs on buildings that said no colored allowed. You guys can't see that today.
Its loss left many families feeling disconnected and isolated.
We just were scattered all over Eugene at that point.
30 years ago, Willie Mims told the Register Guard, "When we had Tent City, it was easy to say that is the problem." The article reads, "The shacks are long gone, and with them the visible evidence of focused discrimination, but more subtle forms of bigotry remain."
It's this underlying feeling and sense of not being wanted, not being accepted, not being white. Why are you here? Why do we have to deal with you?
Black people were still refused service in hotels and restaurants, and there were regular incidents of intimidation and harassment.
Oh, they changed quite a bit, in what there was, like the policemen and stuff. They used to they was really rough on black people. They used to, put the handcuff on them real tight, and they kick them when they get in the car. What I hear people used to say is call them niggas and stuff. I don't know, that's what I heard.
The Ku Klux Klan was active throughout Oregon into the late 60s. Brenda Thompson remembers seeing the men in her household rush out to defend a single mother because members of the KKK were burning a cross in her front yard.
They were rushing up there to her. It was only about a block and a half away. Because she was single and had all these kids, and the Klan had made itself very, very visible and very, very present. And this is how the community was. At that time, they were very close-knit. And so the men all rushed up there, they took their guns, and they went up to defend her and her family.
From discriminatory policies to intimidating scare tactics, racism bled into every aspect of the Black experience.
They lived in hostile living conditions. They were constantly under attack by white people. There was constantly, crosses being burned on the top of Skinner's Butte, reminding them, you stay in your place.
Now they had this black man, he worked for the railroad, but he worked on the train, and he had married this white girl, and they taken and they killed this guy because they didn't want him to marry their daughter, so he got killed. But they said that he died, but I think what happened was that they killed him like everybody said. He was disfigured and everything. To know somebody killed him.
What they do?
They cut his head off and legs and everything else. They killed him. So they seem to think that it was the girl's parents,
They said he died.
They found half his body in the river down there, in this river over there.
And people are leaving the South because of violence, because of lynching, because of all these things. And so when they come here, it is no different than there. And that is something that we have to recognize, is that was probably a disappointment for our brothers and sisters to come here, give of their labor, give of their time, and then to find the same old racism, same old discrimination as they found down south.
Exclusionary housing bylaws were still grandfathered into deeds as late as the 1940s, and real estate agents who helped Black families could lose their licenses. Segregated and Jim Crow social norms were still prevalent into the 70s.
And so you could feel that growing up, the separation. I could feel the separation. I can't speak to those brothers about it, but I could feel the separation for sure. And why that is, that I felt it more than them, I don't know.
Growing up here for me was, I had friends of every race. I learned things from friends of mine's parents.
My dad was a slave, and then to move out here to Oregon, where it was, at that time, I'd probably say 90%, 95% white, and not have a bad word to say about the white race just shocked me, because I know that if I was raised in that type of environment, I'd have a whole lot of negative feelings towards white people. And my dad and mom never, ever one time had a cross word to say about, the white race.
Racism was felt by Black residents throughout the community, from grocery stores to the educational system.
I had to overcome the situation of being like my sister and my brother, being like the only Black kids in schools. So naturally, some of the white kids did not. They just didn't understand. They were naive. They didn't know. They grew up in an all-white world. And if anybody ever saw that's a nigger, okay? And that was their attitude. They didn't know anything about us.
Stockman says that as an athlete, he earned respect from many of his classmates and community throughout high school. At the same time, Black students faced racist faculty that discouraged them from taking advanced courses or attending college.
I came all the way through the school system and never was called nigger once. Okay. But there was another thing going on, that all the Black students had felt the same way. That we didn't have any teachers who was interested in us enough to say, if you want to get a good education, these are the kinds of things that you have to do.
Oregon's first exclusionary law was passed in 1844, preventing previously enslaved Black people from settling in the state.
If Black people did live here, then, they would be lashed, severely, brutally lashed and beaten.
This law was dubbed the Lash Law because it encouraged the whipping of Blacks once every 6 months until they left the state. Although it was repealed a year later, the Lash Law was replaced by another exclusion law in 1849 that prohibited Negroes or mulattoes from entering or living in Oregon. 75 years after the destruction of Ferry Street Village, and many Eugenians are just learning about this history.
Some of those people are still living, who lived there. And people who are currently in this city still have no idea. And if this isn't spread, if this isn't shared, that history will be lost. And then eventually, in 1 or 2 generations, something similar will happen again because nobody's prepared, nobody's aware. We have to learn from it.
Now, Lane County is taking steps to enshrine these events in history, with a monument that will stand in Alton Baker Park where those families lived. According to community leaders, Lily Reynolds Parker, daughter of Sam and Mattie Reynolds, spearheaded efforts and pushed the city to act when the project was in limbo.
We would not be here today without the work of Miss Lily Parker Reynolds and just how much she believed in her people and her community. She, recently passed away. It just feels like a really big hole in the community exists now. She was a beloved member and a pillar of the community, and someone for whom I think we should really look up to in the way that she loved her people, the way she brought her people together, and the way that she was a good elder.
In 2019, UO's Black Cultural Center was named in her honor. Lily Reynolds Parker died on August 22nd, 2024, at 78 years old.
She understood the power of an education, and she was going to do anything and everything she could to help students of color, not just black, but anybody of color, get their degree. And I think the fact that the U of O has dedicated a building after in her name says it all. She had a very strong will, and if she felt that an injustice was being done, she was going to fight to get that injustice corrected.
In the 40s and 50s, Black people were only 1.5% of Eugene's general population, and that remains true today. 7 decades ago, Eugene's Black families had unequal access to housing and job security, creating overall instability.
I was told that my dad used to have a sawmill out Lorraine Highway. Being that he was Black, that they came in and basically took it from him.
Most of the families lived on the Ferry Street land for over 4 years. According to family and community members, it's possible they could have claimed homesteading rights if they were allowed to stay for the 5 years required by the Homesteading Act. Until 1976, the government gave people money to live on and cultivate 160 acres of public land.
With that knowledge being out there, it's hard for me to say that it's not deliberate, but I can't definitively, having not been there, say that it was.
They allowed them to live on that land, and then at the 12th hour came in and decided, well, you know what, they're going to have legal rights here pretty soon, we've got to get them off this property. So hence, that's why they took them and told them they had to move out to West 11th.
The county has since apologized for the extreme economic, mental, and physical harm caused to the families who were displaced without suitable alternatives for housing.
Policy is often seen as this really abstract thing, but displacement and land is absolutely about policy, public policy. And so decision makers who have that policy as part of their job and authority, as I said in my speech, we can use public policy as a tool of oppression or as a tool for justice.
With the demolishment of their homes, the bulldozing of their homes, in addition to that, there was a sense of, the sense that I have is that the city and the county did it on purpose. They didn't want Black people to unite. They didn't want Black people to form neighborhoods in a state that is a white utopia, right?
At the September 15th Across the Bridge commemoration at Alton Baker Park, Lane County Commissioner Laurie Trieger stated that Lane County's actions in 1949 were part of a broader strategy to push Black people out of Eugene. Trieger compared segregation to a death by 1,000 cuts.
In this case, if you make it harder and harder for people to survive in a place, eventually often the result is that they leave. And I do believe that was, whether explicitly or implicitly, the intention.
There's still scars, there's still pain, there's still hostility, there's still, just a lot of trauma within the families.
On the 15th, the Black Cultural Initiative and a local artist unveiled the model of a monument that'll be erected in the park by 2026. The design symbolizes those 5 Black pioneer families and the love that held them together through countless hardships. The story of the Across the Bridge community is part of a national story of systemic oppression and displacement.
This is not unique to Lane County, to Eugene, right? This is the story of this land.
Black communities like the Albina neighborhood in Portland and Black Wall Street in Tulsa reflect a similar story of displacement that Eugene's Black families experienced.
It's, just the way that gentrification, the way that urban renewal, the way that eminent domain impacts disproportionately communities of color and Black people across the country, that's really well documented.
Calls for reparations to African Americans have grown over the last half-century here in Eugene and across the country. Despite the apologies and efforts to erect a monument, community members hope to see more atonement.
Pearlie and Leo, they struggled, but they remained firm in their conviction that Eugene was home. It was better than where they had come from, and they were determined to make it better for us, their generation of children. So they, again, had to move out to North Eugene, and everybody else scattered. It was very difficult because no longer could you just run next door. No longer could you just go hang out with your friends. We were everywhere at that point. But we pulled it together and we still persevered. I was angry with Eugene.
The government hasn't actually done any reparative work. Even a monument isn't repairing the harm that was done, right? It is a placemaking and tells a story. But what we would really love to focus on is reparative work, restoration, reparations, and some sort of actual ways of progressing the Black community and the folks who were once here.
But opinions differ on what reparations should actually look like.
They're admitting that they were at fault. They did something wrong, and their way, they think that, showing this little bit of a gratitude towards those families is their way of saying we're sorry. It's great that they are showing and acknowledging that they were wrong, but I think they can do more.
So, I don't know what they could do. Like I said, they're trying to make amends with this. They're going to put it over there so they acknowledge it. For me personally, that's enough.
The federal government paid the first monetary reparations to freed slaves in 1894.
Oh, does that look like reparations? What are reparations? People always think that just means give these people money. It doesn't. It means give them access to do for themselves. Access to build for themselves and for their family. And that is a county, that is a city who acknowledges what's been done in the past and takes the steps to right what was done wrong. That's a city I want to live in.
At the commemoration event, county, city, and state representatives issued apologies and proclaimed their commitment to racial justice and equality.
My grandparents, I would have loved for them to actually get an apology, and even for someone to recognize the fact that they were human and that it wasn't okay.
One of the last remaining elders says despite decades of hurt and anger, she's thankful for the progress Eugene has made to acknowledge its wrongdoing.
Nobody's ever apologized for the wrongs that were done, for the trauma they caused, until we hear it today. But to this point, no. There was no, when they put a gun in my face, they didn't apologize for that. I'm grateful to the city, the county, and the state for acknowledging the wrongdoing because it was horrendous. It's like not a giant leap, but a leap forward.
Moving forward, Eugene's Black families are focused on generational healing and truth-telling.
And so there's a lot of work to do. Like I said, home ownership, educational achievement, economic achievement, all these things we need to continue to address in the Black community because they are reparative, because there's been intentional harm in the past, and we have to have intentional repair now.
Their healing bolstered by the community's efforts to acknowledge its role in the wrong that was done here 75 years ago.
Don't you want